This episode is brought to you by Education Perfect, a complete teaching and learning toolkit built to support Canadian classrooms. Education Perfect empowers educators to track progress, personalize learning, and support purposeful practice. It's easy to use, flexible, and designed to help Canadian teachers amplify their impact in the classroom. See for yourself and book a free demo today at educationperfect.com.
So equity of access important, equity of experience, making sure that all of our kids are able to engage in all of the experiential learning, that there aren't barriers to playing on teams, to going on field trips, to experiencing clubs. Those have to be ironed out, and that's on us as educators to plan in a coordinated manner in that way. The opportunities we provide them, exposing kids to career paths, also has to be equal across the board.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Today's guest is Pino Buffone. I've known Pino for years, and we share a common story. We were both raised in an Italian immigrant household, and we were shaped by families who carried deep values of resilience, humility, and the belief that education was a path to a better life. Pino has never forgotten that experience, and it shows up in everything he does. Few education leaders bring both the lived experience and system-wide insight that Pino offers. He's been a teacher, principal, superintendent, and now serves as the Director of Education for the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. But before all that, he was a kid in Ottawa, learning English as a second language and navigating systems his parents really didn't understand. Pino is a fierce advocate for equity, not as a slogan, but as a design principle. He's committed to creating systems where students don't just survive. They belong, they succeed, and they help shape what comes next. His thinking is grounded in his own upbringing, shaped by his work in international education, and driven by a deep respect for the courage and contributions of immigrant families. In this episode, we talk about Pino's childhood, his discovery that his father was illiterate, and how that revelation helped shape his role as an educator. We also explore the enormous gifts that newcomer families bring to schools and what real equity looks like, not just in policy, but in daily practice. Pino shares the structural changes he's leading in Ottawa to close equity gaps, reimagine secondary pathways, and build a system where all kids, not just the privileged few, have access to opportunity and choice. And finally, we discuss his passion for international education, why he believes global partnerships matter more now than ever, and how districts can actually act as paradiplomatic forces for peace and understanding in a fractured world. So I really enjoyed this conversation because it, as you will hear, is really honest and sincere, deeply human, and full of practical wisdom for educators doing the hard work of building a better system. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Pino Buffone. Pino Buffone, welcome to the podcast. Where do we find you today?
Thank you. Here in the beautiful National Capital Region of Ottawa, Ontario, Canada.
Wonderful, Pino. So I would have given you a proper introduction at this stage, but can you describe your current role for the audience?
Sure. I'm Director of Education at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board.
Great. So, Pino, I know we want to talk a lot about your work and your role there in Ottawa, but I always like to start these interviews by giving the audience a sense of who the person is behind the directorship. So, can you describe for us or tell us where and when you grew up?
Certainly, Jason. It's a pleasure to be with you on the podcast. I am the son of immigrants from Italy. Both my mother and my father came in the late 50s, early 60s to Canada and settled into Ottawa. I was a student in the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, started kindergarten fluent, just not in English, and so had a real wonderful upbringing at home, predominantly at home. I'm Canadian born, but in a really tight-knit Italian family. Started kindergarten fluent in Italian, less so in English, but was a student here in Ottawa Carleton for the better part of 14 to 15 years. and then a member of staff for 19 years before returning. I went to become Director of Education in the Renfrew County District School Board for 6.5 years, felt like 6.5 days. Was a wonderful experience, and now returned in August of 2023 as Director of Education here. So I've been a student, a member of staff, and now Director here in Ottawa.
That's a great story, and I think that's a rarity amongst a lot of the directors, like to be a director in the district that educated you. I don't know if I've interviewed anybody that's had that experience.
Yeah, it's a real honor, a real wonderful opportunity. I never would have thought it, but very grateful for the opportunities I had, and just the experience, again, as a student, as the member of staff. The district has really shaped me personally and professionally.
You must have come across a lot of your former teachers over the years. What was that like?
Absolutely.
What was that like, Pino?
It's been amazing. I recently went to a hockey game, and as I went to get my drink, the person at the cash said, "Oh, it's covered for you." And I said, "Covered?" And then out popped a head from behind the back that was making some of the teas, coffees, the donuts, that kind of thing, and said, "Mr. Buffone, you had me in grade 6. I was a real pain. I just want to get this one for you. Thank you for being my teacher." So yeah, real amazing to run into former students. Real great to run into former staff members. Last night we just had our annual retirement reception, and I was able to do a shout out for a dear colleague, Mary, who I went to Teachers College with, who's retiring this year. So just a real wonderful opportunity to connect with students and staff, past and present, some who've taught me, some that I've taught, and that's sort of the gift of returning as director to a district where I was a student and a member of staff.
You mentioned the Italian immigrant experience, something that we share. I remember same thing, going to kindergarten, not speaking English, and getting a spanking from my teacher because I didn't understand. She said, "Don't go to that station." I understood. Go to that station.
Right.
And my mom was a teacher, was not happy about the spanking. I'll tell you that. But that was a long time ago. What was your experience like growing up in Ottawa? Were you around an Italian community as well?
We were around an Italian community for our first few years. The years when I look back, I think my parents were learning to sort of settle into a new country, and so we're tight with the people who had sponsored them in essence, and that was a real family trickle down. An aunt had married one of my uncles whose family had immigrated, one of the first immigrants to come to the Ottawa area. And they just started sponsoring sort of, in the family through marriage, my aunt and then her brothers, my father in that train. So it was a really wonderful experience on a number of fronts. One, I've always thought I've lived in the best of both worlds, a very North American world, but tied in this way to a very traditional European world. And so there's always a dynamic between those worlds, which I've grown to appreciate over time. There were times as I grew up that I was a bit frustrated with that, but by and large, it's been amazing and a gift really to me to have that duality, that diaspora of an Italian Canadian culture, and then of course a Canadian upbringing and a link to Italy. We have family homes in Italy. We return regularly. I go now almost every summer to get a break, but it was a wonderful upbringing. My parents always placed a value on education and the importance of public education and staying focused on that. And at the same time, they had a really great sense and wealth internally of resourcefulness, of resilience that has served me well since that time. Just learning from them that they made do, right? They, we didn't have a lot of money growing up. Initially, we're much, we're privileged to be much more well off now than we were at that time. And so I recall my parents just sort of making do with what they had and not letting anything go to waste. And they were just sharp about how they lived their life. And I think it instilled in me that resourcefulness, that resilience, and also the work ethic to do your part in whatever challenge you've got in front of you. So that benefited me more and more over time. I think that upbringing was also a gift, although not maybe affluent or privileged in nature. It was a real benefit for me. It wasn't anything I would ever look down on.
Yeah, so I imagine like a lot of current immigrants as well. The parents are busy working and have to have that work ethic to change a life in the way they change their lives. When they were busy
Absolutely.
working and as you were growing up, how did you play as a child?
For me, I was very competitive as a kid. Loved playing sports, loved soccer. That was also an internal part of the drive I had within me and whatever I was doing. Really collaborative. Used to hang out with cousins a lot, and as we got more and more integrated, my circle of friends and connections expanded. We eventually moved to an area that wasn't it was a non-Italian area, and so that benefited me greatly because then I just diversified the kind of network I had that was so multicultural, which was wonderful. And to this day, a lot of my friends are from various backgrounds, in addition to the friends and family I have that are Italian. So that part was wonderful as well. I credit my teachers and even my coaches when I was young, just instilling all the right sort of skills into me as part of a broader community, whether that was an academic one, an athletic one, or other. It was great for me in the growing up in Ottawa, and really again just combining the best of both worlds in a Canadian context and an Italian one as well.
Outside of sports, when it comes to your learning, what was the first thing you really remember loving to learn?
For me, it was languages because I went to kindergarten expecting everyone would be fluent in Italian, and that didn't happen that way. And so I realized right away, and since that time, I've always been a lover of languages and a lover of internationalization. Very, very excited about the kind of programming we have here in Ottawa, Carleton, in our dynamic bilingual English and French context, which is wonderful, and also a growing and expanding international education partnerships around the globe: China, Japan, Italy, France, Germany, Colombia. We're looking for a partnership in Africa. So I would say, of the things I love the most growing up, languages would be one, and the other one is just the international context. My father was a tailor by trade. My mom was a seamstress, but he's always had that real connect to doing things in partnership across countries, predominantly Italy and Canada, but I see a lot of that in him. And Jason, I didn't realize my dad was illiterate until second year university. I can't believe I'm saying this, but all through schooling, on a Sunday afternoon, he would sit me down and we go through the bills. We cut the lawn and we go through the bills. That was sort of our Sundays. In the spring and the fall and the winter, we'd shovel. And I just thought, okay, that's my chore. I never understood he couldn't read or write. He would have me sign checks. He would have me read what would come in and then direct what I was to do. And I just thought that was a chore. I sprung out of bed one day in second year university. I was at Queen's University in Kingston, and I realized, oh my God, he can't read all along. And it never hit me. He never complained. He was excellent at speaking. Even though it was broken English, he could communicate. And so he built skills. And a lot of that language love, I think, was built off of what my parents did just to get by over time. Same with my mom, can't read or write, but they are very successful people in their own right and still instilled the value of education in us, knowing it was important, even though they couldn't help per se. They helped the most by actually saying, this is a value, you got to focus in here.
That's a fascinating story. It reminds me of Jacques Demers. You must have heard that story, right? A famous hockey coach who went his whole life being illiterate. And one of the things that struck me when Demers came out and started talking about it publicly was the shame he felt his whole life. Did you ever talk about that with your dad?
It's interesting. One year at one of our conferences, we had Jacques Demers as a keynote speaker. And when he told this story, and at that time I was a principal in the system here, and he spoke to how he would bring flowers to one of the assistants in St. Louis for the Blues to say, listen, I'm going to need your help here because I'm very busy. And so she would go through things a lot like my dad did, even setting up the lineup card of various sorts. He'd get others to do it. The coping mechanisms were incredible. And you think of a coach who was a Stanley Cup winner, not being able to read and yet navigating around it. And I see a lot of that in my dad. And it's funny you mentioned that, because after he spoke to us, it's well over a decade now, it might be about 15 years ago that he came to speak at one of our conferences. I was telling my father that story, and just my dad was reminiscing on some of the things he had to do to sort of to get by. But you learn it, right? You learn the strategies, you become resourceful, resilient, and you work at it. You work at it to make sure that barrier is something you can overcome. Well, so it's an interesting analogy, because Jacques Demers reminds me a lot of the experience my father had.
Well, and then there's a real cunning and I'd even say intelligence that is forced upon them to navigate all those situations. So has that impacted how you viewed things like literacy in your job and your mission, and maybe even more broadly in how you look at educating younger immigrant kids?
Most definitely. The first thing I would say, Jason, is I don't, and I remind people not to look down on that. Our family used to live off of a street in Ottawa called Spadina. And when I look at that home now, I drive by it every once in a while and think, we were 4 or 5 families in that home. I shared a room with my uncle, who was my godfather, and I was 5 and he was 25. It was a miracle he didn't kill me, but I think of a 25-year-old sharing a room with a 5-year-old, but that was our dynamic, right? And I think a couple of things. One, to be careful not to criticize those populations going through that journey now. Multi-families to a home, trying to survive. Don't disrespect it, because the Italians were there at one point, and so were the Irish, and so were others. So I would say that's a really important point, that was part of a journey in becoming Canadian, for our family at least. So I don't look down on that at all currently, and especially with the upbringing that I had. The other one is just to respect the skills and talents and gifts that those families bring. And I'll give you a great example, Jason. I've had the privilege of working, excuse me, in some of the most needy sites in Ottawa, some of the most high, we call it RAISE indexed, highest needs schools. And, if you're going to have an evening in those schools that is bringing families in, and you call it, a parent council night, you'll get a small handful. But what I used to do in some instances, a couple of times a year, is have a cultural night where I'd say to the families, bring your music, bring your photos, bring your history, bring your artifacts. The place was packed. And I will tell you, the kinds of talents these people had. Okay, they were newcomers to the country. They may not have had the degrees that a lot of the job expectations are now. They may not have even been doing their actual career from where they came, but boy, are they beautiful people. Are they smart? Are they brilliant and bright? They can share so much with us. And they were teaching, what I love the most is a lot of our newcomer families were teaching some of the Canadian-born kids about Eritrea, or maybe it was, some of the culture in Afghanistan, how rugs are made, or all these kinds of amazing talents that the kids here wouldn't have been exposed to if not for the strength of that diversity. So I would say it definitely has shaped my approach to multilingual learners, both in terms of the respect to have for their families and those kids, and then how can we bridge their passions to their pathways, whatever that might be, because not every student comes and starts as I did. I was Canadian born, but I was, learning the language, so to speak. Some of them come in grade 5 or in grade 11. We got to find a way to connect them to some future for them. So it definitely has shaped my experience. And I would say on balance, the kids I gravitate towards the most for me are multilingual learners and how they're navigating our system currently. And it's as complex now as it was then, maybe more so because they've got more choices. But I think we're making gains in opening pathways for their futures, whatever that may be.
Do you have, and I just wonder if in your story there's some learnings for some of these folks. Like, how did you go from a family that wasn't educated to wanting to be a teacher? When did that happen?
Yeah, when I graduated from high school, the vast majority of my family, my cousins in particular of my age, were all heading into construction, which was a traditional family path, for lack of a better term. Although my parents weren't in construction, my father in particular, my uncles were, and I said to them, I'm going away for university, and there was almost an intervention, Jason, where they said, why, right? You're not going to get a job when you come out of it. You're going to spend a lot of money, and then you're going to need to come and work for us anyway when you're done. So it was an interesting experience. I all joking aside, they always supported me. My family, supported me, and when I went to school, a science degree, I loved it, and I wasn't intending to go away. A good friend of mine was convincing me, come on, let's leave town, let's get an experience somewhere else. We had the marks. I was doing fairly well in school. I wasn't doing poorly. And at the end of the day, I said, no, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying home. And we flipped. He ended up staying home, and I ended up taking this opportunity in another city, which was good for me at that time to be away from home. But all to say, when I graduated, I was sort of headed into two paths. One was actually three paths, Jason. One was in the sciences. I was working at the time for Health Canada here in Ottawa, summer jobs over time, which was great, around DNA amplification. I was looking at the various factors, the media for which the amplification of DNA would be optimized, whether that's the medium, the nutrients, the temperature, all those kinds of factors, to be able to take insect fragments and reculture the insect from the DNA, almost like a mini Jurassic Park kind of thing, which was really interesting in the Health Sciences Center, although I wasn't sure I was going to go on in the health studies. I wasn't interested in medicine per se, but that was a sort of an area I was exploring. The other one was the diplomatic corps. I was really interested in the Foreign Service at the time. It's now called Global Affairs Canada. At the time, it was called the Foreign Service, and I was applying for diplomacy to become a diplomat, and it's a fairly extensive process. And so I was exploring that. And I also knew I had a love of teaching, but my marks were not strong coming out of university. They were coming out of high school. Out of university, they were fairly average. They weren't anything to brag about. And at the time, in the mid-90s, it was really difficult to get into teachers college. And so I didn't expect I would get into teachers college. I was turned down by every institution I applied for in Ontario. You got to apply, I think, for 3 at the time. And so I was applying in Quebec and elsewhere. And I was the last entrance to McGill University. So literally on the same day, I had an offer to go into the Foreign Service and an offer to go into Teachers College at McGill. And I had already turned down a master's program, a multi-country master's program in sciences on work around DNA amplification, which was a really neat opportunity. But I thought, well, I want to try the Foreign Service. I can come back to this. And then when the Teachers College one came through on, and it was something like the 30th of August, it was late in the game to go to Montreal to be their last entrance. I took it because I knew I had a love of teaching, and I always wondered, should I have gone the Foreign Service Corps route? But I don't regret my decision now, and it's part of the reason I think I have such a passion for international education here in the district. It's a great article, and I'll send it to you, Jason. It's on paradiplomacy, how school boards can be like paradiplomats, where when you give young, influential minds an opportunity to experience another culture, it's almost like a form of diplomacy. And so school boards do that in exchanges. So all to say, I made my way, made my way to McGill for Teachers College and never looked back since. It's been a great career.
Well, I look forward to that article, and we'll make sure it's in the notes here for the podcast because we'll share that as well. So, Pino, you've told us this really fascinating story. I think one common to a lot of listeners from different backgrounds, an immigrant story, parents uneducated, to now being the director. And it's kind of interesting, as you're saying, that slight regret or curiosity of going into foreign services. You, in a way, from what I know of your work, have done that through the district work. Um, in all the jurisdictions that you've seen and you've networked with, what are some of the most inspiring stories that you've come across?
So I would say a year ago, and we have a network that runs our international education. It's its own entity, and it's run by an executive director, a wonderful gentleman, Jacques, and we have a partnership in terms of how we connect with other jurisdictions around the globe. And I said to Jacques when I returned to Ottawa, Carleton in August of 2023, Jacques, when you need me somewhere, I'll be there. And if you don't, I trust your, excuse me, taking staff and exploring what partnerships can happen. He said, well, Pino, you've got to come with me to China this fall of 2023. And China's, not a country without some friction, some challenges, some great opportunities. It's a wonderful place. I will share when I went there and visited a school for special needs, how impressed I was, where it was not something I would have expected. And yet it was just a wonderful experience, and actually brought back some great strategies around special education coming from a country like China, which is great to see, and breaks down some of the stereotypes that I even thought I would have experienced. And I think that's part of that paradiplomacy. We've got a wonderful partnership going with France. We're on the verge of bringing in many teachers from France to come to teach here en français in our immersion program for a year or 2 years, and also are looking to send teachers who are English language mother tongue to France to teach their English classes. Another wonderful partnership, that one tied to the languages versus the special needs. And I'm really exploring, Jason, opportunities in countries that are specific. Maybe it's in the Northern Europe, where we can get a really good sense from Sweden, from Finland, from Norway, around their early years, their almost their kindergarten or pre-kindergarten programs, and how they set those students up societally for success in their areas. And I would love to send a group of custodians somewhere where there are greeting projects happening that we can learn from and implement in our system to be more environmentally sustainable. So these aren't, from my perspective, they're not sightseeing ventures. There are some times where you're visiting a country and you go to see a local site, you learn about the history, but they're really experiential learning opportunities tied to credit generation, or if it's at the elementary level, to building and rounding, global competencies of collaboration, cooperation, creativity, those kinds of things. So these are really great learning experiences for us and our students, both in hosting and in going abroad. So just a couple of examples of some inspiring things that I've seen already in my short return to Ottawa Carleton, and we're really expanding that out for the district.
That's wonderful. And, I kind of feel that, districts are kind of slow to that game. Like, businesses do that all the time. American businesses in the 80s started going to Japan like crazy because Japan figured out all kinds of amazing, different manufacturing and business processes. And there's no reason that we shouldn't be doing that with education. In fact, one of my pet theories around education resonates. So I really got to read that article because K-12 education is one of the areas that every country can share, and it's not a zero-sum game. Like, there's nothing that the Chinese have to hide from the Americans or the Americans have to hide. When you have good practice in K-12, it's going to make the cultures tighter. It's going to make them learn from each other. It's going to create better, hopefully, global citizens if we're doing it right. So I appreciate hearing that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That article speaks to the 1980s and a number of students from Russia coming to the U.S., even at the dismay of the government.
Right.
Not entirely supportive, but allowing it to happen. And those young students then becoming society's leaders, breaking down the Cold War, saying, you know what? I spent 2 weeks in Nebraska. They're beautiful people, right? sort of dispelling some of the stereotypical ideas. Jason, with the challenges our globe has right now, with some of the territorialism that's happening, I feel this is needed more than ever, not less, actually more, to be able to get ahead of that increasing issue that we're seeing currently with some of the challenges in the global partnerships we have. All to say, I think it's needed more than ever, and it's a great example. I'll send you that, and I'll send you an article I wrote. I write a piece about every semester, a thought leadership series. I'll send you the article on internationalization in our district, just because it reflects our approach to this work.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that's shared with everyone as well. I have read a number of your articles, and now's probably a good time to get into them. I'm particularly struck by the amount of focus, time, and energy you spent on not only what a lot of superintendents do in their districts, and rightly so, trying to build, new models of equity within their districts, but you're actually taking the time to write and to think and express your views on equity. Can you give us a high-level overview of some of that writing and some of that thinking?
Sure, Jason. And, the articles I write are not scholarly by any means, but I write them myself. They're not artificially generated, although my daughter says, Dad, why didn't you spent 9 days on that? Why didn't you plug it into AI? You could have done it in 9 seconds. And one of our administrators actually took one of my articles and fed it through a large language module and sent it back to me. And I thought, gosh, it's even better written than I had written it. So there is something to be learned. So I am
the key is
AI.
Just let me just make, because this is also one of the other themes that we're talking about, how AI is changing education. The key is, though, that you learned everything by writing it. And then, we can get a different perspective on it. But the fact that you wrote it without it, I think is a great model for everyone listening to this. Is that's how you write. You write without the model, or else it warps what you want to say, or it'll warp your learning process. Afterwards, then you can extend your learning. You can extend your writing. Yeah. But anyway, I just wanted to make that point. So
absolutely, I would agree, and that's what I'm going to start doing. And the next one I've got coming up is on elementary programming, and I'm going to write it this month to get my second one in for this year, about 2 a year. But in terms of an equity perspective, for me, it's really about equity of access and experience, opportunity, and then most importantly, outcomes. If we provide greater equity of access, and I'll speak to that, and equity of experience, I'll speak to that as well, through our opportunities, but it doesn't result in outcomes that differ, then I think, Jason, we've just talked a good game.
Yeah.
Whether it's for various groups of students, our Black students, our Indigenous students, for instance, as two examples, but other students as well, our students with special needs, our multilingual learners, we've got to make sure that we have them having the ability to access programs and services we offer for all kids. There shouldn't be a difference based on where you live, or quite frankly, based on your knowledge. And a good example of that comes back to my own upbringing. My parents, when we were living with others, and even when we moved with other families in the family, and when we moved, my parents just found the closest school and said, that's where you go. It wasn't till later one of my sisters said, hey, Mom and Dad, why didn't you put us in French immersion? We're fluent in Italian. We would have aced it. My parents said, what are you talking about? That's the school. Go and enroll. They didn't realize, well, this school's got immersion. That one's English. That kind of issue to access and equity of access is a problem. And, Jason, it's a problem today. It's a problem for newcomers today who simply don't know how to navigate the system. So equity of access, making sure, especially at the elementary level, all students have access to the programs we have. And the idea for me is like a tree. You keep the kids together in the tree trunk as much as you can for as long as you can, so that you keep as many doors open as you possibly can, so that when they get to secondary, when they're a little bit older, a little bit more mature, they can start to connect their passions to their pathways. They can go out into the branches of the tree, apprenticeship or college, maybe it's university, the workforce, community living for students with special needs. Those are the branches of the tree that expand outwards. So I would say the equity work for us at the elementary level is keeping kids together and doors open, so that the affluent white kids don't head in this direction and the Black and Indigenous kids head in this other direction. That changes their outcomes. Keep them together. There's strength in our diversity. And then as they get to secondary, then you're looking at allowing them to choose when it's right. It's not the same for every student. They're not widgets. There are different pathways and different timing for pathways. They can choose the one that will lead them to success, so that whatever they do in life, whatever their employment is a lot like a hobby and a lot less like the thought of work itself. And that's the key. So equity of access, important. Equity of experience, making sure that all of our kids are able to engage in all of the experiential learning, that there aren't barriers to playing on teams, to going on field trips, to experiencing clubs. Those have to be ironed out, and that's on us as educators to plan in a coordinated manner in that way. The opportunities we provide them, exposing kids to career paths, also has to be equal across the board. It cannot solely be for those whose parents and guardians, and there's nothing wrong with this, it's not a judgment, but who are fortunate enough to be able to expose their kids to certain pathways. We've got to make sure all kids see pathways, try things. Maybe sometimes you don't like it, maybe sometimes you do. And then again, ultimately the outcomes. When our students graduate, we've got to be looking at the trends in not only credit accumulation and graduation rates, but which students entered which pathways. Do we have a balance that is reasonable for society to ensure that it doesn't look like some kids have access to this and some ultimately don't? So those are all factors to the equity discussion that are very important for me. And I'm really excited, Jason. We've just been through a program review at the elementary level that's going to strengthen that tree trunk. We're going down from 4 programs to 2 to keep our students together, differentiate by all means based on their needs, but keep them together in a dynamic bilingual environment, English or French, with both programs having a little bit of the other language. So you can get basically a more French or more English, depending on your interests. And then in secondary, exposing them to those branches, letting them really move their way through whatever pathway it is that they want to see for their future. So important work. It's work that's taking place right now. It's going to take us a decade, literally, to phase some programs out as we bring the 2 programs, enhanced English and French immersion, together. That's going to be exciting for us in the move forward. And at the secondary level, I really think we're already doing a lot of that work. We've got our pathways, the 5 pathways, really vibrant and in place. We just need to refine a few aspects of it, but we're getting there.
So, Pino, I know you've listened to the podcast, and other leaders across Canada in particular listen to this to hear from their peers. And you've written about how we have to go beyond just policy statements and towards fostering, like you're saying in these situations, lived experiences. Do you have any advice or practical steps for leaders of districts to kind of close that gap, especially when working in larger and more complex districts?
Yeah, Jason, thank you. It's a complex question. What I would say there is I'm less worried about our policy and more worried about our procedure. And I'll explain what I mean. Districts, large, complex institutions of public education tend to have, by and large, the right policy statements, the right motherhood statements that speak to what they aspire to, especially when it comes to equity, and especially in nowadays. It's almost essential. And if you don't, you really need to refine that. That's not what I worry about as much. What I worry about is the procedure and actually how the policy plays out in day-to-day interactions. It's almost like a comparison between racism and subtle racism. I'm more worried about subtle racism than I am about overt racism, thank goodness, because it happens less, but I think it happens. But it's the subtle pieces that we need, all of us, the whole organizational family, to be sort of critically conscious of our decision making and to be aware of our biases, so that we stop ourselves and one another from decisions that would inadvertently or advertently create a systemic barrier. And I think that's the harder work, is those subtle pieces in the procedures and the protocols and the practices that happen that at the end of the day, if your outcomes don't change, even if you had a really good policy, then you know you've got procedural issues and some of these more subtle forms of systemic barriers that prevent kids from achieving their highest potential. So my only caution for senior leaders would be in that area, that it's not solely, you write a policy, everyone follows a policy, great. Check your procedures, check your practices, check your protocols, especially if they're traditional or ingrained in nature. They're harder to change, even with a policy change. That's the parts that I operationally look for when I visit schools weekly. I look for, okay, how is that policy actually playing out in practice in the procedure? And that's not a disrespect to any of our site-based leaders or staff. It's hard work in schools nowadays, Jason, and there's a lot on their plate, and sometimes we don't get the policy quite right, or the procedure for that matter. That's when we get feedback from them, refine it, bring something else forward that hopefully leads to a better future.
You mentioned professional learning networks as a good tool for system level change in some of your work. Is this what you're pointing to here as to how that work happens, and what distinguishes like an effective PLN in a district setting, and like how do you build the conditions for that kind of ongoing shared learning culture so it exists beyond your tenure and into the next superintendent's term?
Yeah, also a great prompt. There's a couple of pieces for that with respect to PLNs and those networks, and there are tensions to be managed. So for me, one of them is I think there's a place for both formal professional learning networks and informal ones, and we see that all the time. We see our staff. This morning I was at a school, Osgood Township High School, who was just demonstrating for me some incredible work they're doing in their specialist high skills major around communications technology. Phenomenal work on building some gaming elements that they're in a competition for. There's a group of educators there that work together, and it's an informal network. It's not something we run centrally. It's not even something the school is sort of formalizing. They're just working together in the craft of the profession in education as an informal network across some schools. A few different schools, staff were there as well. That's amazing. We've got to nurture that, and more than anything else, not block it from happening. We've got to let those informal networks keep happening. The other one is formalized networks, ones that might be centrally run, that focus on the specific targets or goals of the district, that are more formalized in nature. Those are both important. Another tension to be managed, whether those happen in person or online or some hybrid of that, both are very valuable. Jason, right now, one of the challenges we're having in public education, I'd say it's well beyond our district, but definitely in our district, is the fact that it's very hard to release teachers. We're short in staffing. And so the ability to connect quickly online as opposed to releasing someone for in person when you're having a hard time with the replacements is a great opportunity for people to connect on quick bursts. So, formal and informal, in person and online, tied to specific aspects of the curriculum, or as another tension, other holistic aspects of a student's world. Very, very important. The curriculum is important. By all means, it's got to be our driver, but there are other aspects of a student's life that as educators, we can guide them and support them in. Might be healthy choices, could be wellness or mental health, could be lots of areas beyond just the curriculum. So all of those tensions to be managed to me are what's important in the mix of a sound professional learning network. And it's not a recipe. It depends on the context. And in one area, you might do something really informally tied to the curriculum. In another, you might do something very formal in nature, but tied to, developing positive mental health skills, as an example. So lots to be explored there. But I think it's all of those factors together in the right context and leaning on the leverage points that'll get you further ahead, that'll make all the difference for learning networks that are professional in nature.
So, Pino, especially in this day and age where AI is really, to use a really old metaphor now, upsetting the apple cart. I don't know when the last time I saw an apple cart was, but the metaphor still stands. And leadership now more than ever requires, I think, crazy urgency or a crazy focus on balancing urgency and patience for some models that we know work. So, I guess it's change now versus like systemic long-term change. What are some of the hardest trade-offs, if I can phrase it that way, that you've had to navigate?
Sure. From my perspective, Jason, and this in my own professional development, one of the most influential models of thinking that I benefited from. I took part in the Rotman School of Management's executive leadership program at one point in time when I was an early superintendent before I became director. And one of the models that Roger Martin purports is around integrative thinking, where you take various aspects of variables that are seemingly opposed in nature, and you think and rethink how you can bring them together for an outcome that doesn't lose sight of any one of the variables, but takes the best of them both, or the best of the mix of them. So integrative thinking to me is a critical piece, and I would say it comes across on a number of areas, including relationships with federations where people are coming from different perspectives. Try and meld those together to the best that you can. Sometimes waiting on a decision to give more time to think through how there can be a win-win, not a win-loss. But in terms of trade-offs, because there is a bit of tension in how you manage that, I would say when it comes to artificial intelligence and really any emerging technology, quantum thinking is another good example where we're on the cusp here of some really, really interesting aspects of the evolution of quantum work. I would say I think there's going to be change in the teaching and learning approach. I think there already has been, but we will really move forward to what I would call, and this isn't a new notion, but in the spirit of the flipped classroom, where students are actually going home and doing the lesson per se. Checking, up online on some recipe that they need for a cooking class, and just giving a thought to, okay, what are the ingredients I'm going to need here? They might be looking at a segment from the news around conflict in the Middle East or something else where we're going to be talking the next day about a perspective on it, where they're doing the lesson at home. And it could be watching a 4-minute video on how to do fractions. It could be any one of those things, and coming back in the classroom for the practical application. And I see that day in, day out in our schools, and not just lesson-driven classes, but the actual application. I think we're headed more in that direction so that then we are able to, in the context of the teaching and learning environment, guide our students through exactly what you said at the outset. Their ideas down in some format that then they can use a large language model to adjust it, to adapt it, to shorten it, to lengthen it, to summarize it, that kind of thing, rather than a lesson during the day and the at-home application runs the risk of being generated elsewhere. So the key to me in all this and the teaching and learning approach is that the thinking is happening live in real time. Not that there won't be thinking at home at night, of course they will be, but when it comes to the actual learning of content or the learning of a particular direction or a concept, that can easily be done as the homework, so to speak. And then you're really just applying every day at school, making school engaging, energetic, interest-driven, meaningful. A great example of the high school I was at this morning, Jason, they were talking about in this ComTech work about AutoCAD, which is a program that a number of our educators use, but they were using the real life software for aerodynamics of a race car development that came from Formula One. So they have a partnership with Formula One, and these kids enter a competition to design race cars. They weren't using AutoCAD. They were using the actual Formula One endorsed piece. And some of the students at this high school are going to be spending next weekend an hour and a half in one of the car pits for a Formula One race, which they were doing a bit of the trial run races, and they invited them there. So isn't that interesting that you could use AutoCAD, but actually here's what the industry's using. And what was interesting, the young fellow, Aiden, that was speaking to me, a grade 11 or 12 student, was saying, actually, it's not any more complicated than AutoCAD. It's actually easier in a lot of ways. Why not use the most meaningful, industry standard software in a communications technology class, as opposed to a software that's there, nothing wrong with the other version, but connecting it more meaningfully to what's happening in the real world.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm going to try connecting some of your equity thinking and equity work to your vision of future classrooms, or rather, I would like you to do that. Because you cite this idea that I kind of really love, that you want to encourage students not just to have like equal footing to watch the game, quote unquote, the game be played, but to actually play the game, or even better, invent the game. So if you could redesign public education from scratch, what's the one core design principle you'd really want to include?
If I was redesigning beyond the point of keeping kids together at elementary as long as you can, and having inclusive environments where you're really differentiating right off the start, rather than streaming kids at a young age, which I think the province realizes some of the detriment of streaming and some of the research that's come through, including why we don't, we de-streamed grade 9 mathematics and other courses, for instance. What I would do at the secondary level is backwards design the 30 credits to graduation, to say to students, based on their aptitudes, their interests, and you might have to stage this a bit. It might not be all 30 courses that a kid would line up in grade 9 and, then their interests change by grade 11. But even in 2-year chunks, two-year chunks, to say to students, look, if you were designing what would bring you here, what would have you stay in classrooms even after the bell left because you were so engaged, what would it be? And the idea here would be to say, beyond a set of compulsories that I would streamline a little bit more effectively and efficiently around like essential literacy and essential numeracy. No issue
foundation
with that.
Courses, yeah.
But beyond that, kids are designing their credits towards a future they're going to get to or that they're interested in. It would prevent a lot of students from being in courses for which they just have to get that credit and get out. Mm-hmm. To me, that's not healthy learning. Like I just got to jump through this hoop, get it, and I'm on my way. I never want to see this again. So as long as we can cover off on core skills, literacy and numeracy, and allow students to get a breadth and depth of exposure to other courses that would be almost a self-selected menu, I think we would see a lot more students engaged in schooling, higher graduation rates and credit accumulation, and probably, to my mind, exiting the system with greater purpose for their future. And again, when I speak of those streamlined compulsory courses, there may be some that might be one about world values or global aspects. There might be a handful of courses every year that every student takes, but to draw down the number of compulsories, increase the number of electives, so that kids are really engaging in their learning that they've driven and hasn't been driven for them based on a past that might not be their future. I think a lot of students leave our system and then really are thrust into either a post-secondary journey that is much more meaningful or one that they're not quite as prepared as they could have been if they had more ability to select. Now that requires, Jason was saying that it requires a massive influx, to my mind, in counseling and guidance for students. It also would need to allow for the ability to transition from one pathway to another more seamlessly. So it's not without its challenges operationally, but if I was redesigning, I would redesign that way, and drawing down from 8 compulsories or 17 compulsories to 12 or 13 electives, I would bring that into almost a flip, do 10 to 12 compulsories and then have 18 to 20 electives to try and engage authentic learning to a greater extent. And it might mean, too, that you would go to this school if you were really interested in this pathway, but that school if you wanted another one at the secondary level. At the secondary level, based on interests, I don't have an issue with that. At elementary, it's a lot more difficult because those kids are young. They often don't really know what options are out there. I would keep those kids together. But at secondary, I think a lot of kids would very willingly go to a different school if they were actually taking, that's got the drama that I really want to get into and the filmmaking or whatever it might be.
Or multiple.
I'm off to it. I would rather go there than here if I'm taking.
On Monday, I'm at this school. On Wednesday, I'm at that school. Like that could be the dream. But if I could actually ask you to dream further, if you look 50 years out, what does education look like to you?
To me, 50 years out, we've probably come to learn the hard way that the bricks and mortar environment we have in a lot of our settings has now really, really adapted. And again, we're already on this journey of a much more hybrid environment of online and in person. I think the in-person is important. I think some of the flexibility I spoke to in the most recent prompt around a vision of the future, that hybrid environment, that online options, the ability to connect with like-minded individuals will be a much greater thing of the future. And I would say one of the areas that's exciting, again, we're on this journey, but I think it's going to explode in the next number of years, even the next decade, is really having our secondary pathway connected to post-secondary and industry even more, where we're having industry experts coming in, working with youth, inspiring them on thinking for the future, which was kind of what I saw this morning in the ComTech specialization classes that I visited. They were connected to people, one of whom was literally online in an online meeting with an industry partner asking for advice. Just saying, I can't figure this out in the program I'm developing. What do you recommend? What do you think is the issue? And they were just engaging in that way. So it was really, really great to see. I think that's going to grow even further so that schools become even more integrated and connected aspects of society and not some separate endeavor that gets you a certificate to then go live. Living in the experience of large, complex public institutions like schools and school board.
I certainly hope we get there and we get it right so we get there. The last question is always, what book, movie, album, podcast, besides this one, of course, would you recommend to the audience?
I've been enjoying these podcasts, so I've really have, Jason. Kudos to you and congratulations on your leadership in the sector and in society on running these podcasts. So this is one of them. I'm still a fan and a lover of books. I've been reading Sacred Economics from Charles Eisenstein, just a book about how, in a very capitalistic world, we've got to make sure even while we're making money, we're protecting the planet. And so, economics that become more sacred in nature, respect other elements. I think there's a lot of diversity that understands that. Our Indigenous partners really understand that concept of protecting the planet while you are living on it and in it, and even making money in it, for that matter. So it's a real good book that I'm in and I return to, and I pick it up and I leave it, I reflect on it, I come back to it. So I've been reading through that particular book, which I've enjoyed. And then I'm reading through The Life and Death of the Black Crowes, which was a band I really enjoyed back in the 90s, and just picked up a book that I'm reading through the interesting life of a rock and roll band, both the highs and the lows. So just something that takes me away from education altogether.
I love rock and roll
like
biographies.
Economics. So a couple of books that I'm in the midst of.
And the Black Crowes is a great band. Pino, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Great to be with you, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.